Before we discuss water management in great detail, we need to step back and identify what we mean by a drainage basin. A drainage basin is all the area of land that contributes water to a specific stream. Two synonyms for drainage basin are watershed and catchment. We tend to use the word watershed here locally. So it's all the land area that contributes water to a stream. So if we look here, we can identify the drainage basin of the Mississippi River. This is the drainage divide, the high elevation region of the Rocky Mountains and around that separate the Mississippi River drainage basin from the Columbia River and the Colorado River drainage basin. And then over here on the eastern side, the Appalachians separate the Mississippi River drainage basin from other smaller drainage basins to the east. So this whole area here is the Mississippi River drainage basin. Any rain that falls anywhere in here, eventually through runoff and stream flow or through groundwater flow, would eventually make its way to the Mississippi River. So the concept of a drainage basin is very important because that's the unit that we use to do water management across the country. It's the logical unit for us to manage water by. Typically, drainage basins are named by the major river that they drain into. Here are some of the larger drainage basins in the world. And the Amazon is by far the largest, followed by the Congo, and the Mississippi is actually the third largest drainage basin in the world. Importantly, though, we can use that term drainage basin on many different levels. Let's go back to this first diagram. We can talk about the drainage basin of this particular river here, and that's all the area within this dashed lines. But we can also talk about the drainage basin maybe for this tributary here, in which case the drainage basin would be this smaller area. Or we can talk about the drainage basin of just this little tiny tributary up here, and thus the drainage basin is much smaller. So drainage basin doesn't imply any sort of size. It's just all the land area that contributes water to a specific stream. The most common wrong answer for what a drainage basin is to say it's where the water flows to. It's not where the water flows to, but rather it's where the water flows from to get to a particular stream. If you're familiar with the geography of where Kenyatta College is located, you'll note that we're right on a drainage divide. All the water that flows on one side of our campus is going to flow down into Redwood City and down to the bay. The water that flows on the other side of our campus won't ever make it to the bay. Rather, it'll flow down the hill towards Highway 280 into that basin there. Anyway, we now know what a drainage basin is, or a watershed, and we know that that's the unit that we use to properly manage water and to deal with water pollution as scientists and land managers. All right, now let's look into some of these water management issues. Generally, when we talk about water management issues, they fall into one of three categories: either too much water, too little water, or water contamination. We'll deal with water contamination on the next topic. So for now, we're going to just focus on the too much and too little problems. First, let's discuss too much water, flooding. Notably, flooding is a natural process. Streams and rivers carve their channels based on their typical stream flow. Flows greater than the typical flow are likely to cause flooding. Also, flooding's a good thing. It results in the deposition of nutrient-rich soil in floodplain areas. And for centuries, humans have been using these fertile floodplains as floodplain soils for agriculture. Consider the Central Valley. Even though flooding is a natural process, flood damage is often increased due to human actions. Pause the video for a moment and consider how each of these actions might increase the flooding potential or the flooding damage in a particular region. Let's go through some of these. For centuries, humans have built on floodplains, and it's understandable. Floodplains are flat, close to water, and have rich agricultural soil. But they do flood. In today's world, we should reconsider floodplain development. Perhaps it makes more sense to set aside floodplains for agriculture and/or recreational uses. At a minimum, we should try to limit high-density urban sprawl on the floodplains. Even with levees, it is inviting disaster and wasting good farmland. Putting high-density developments on floodplains often results in millions or billions of dollars of damage and increased loss of life when floods do occur. Pavement, the hallmark of human development. Consider what current urban areas looked like 100 or 200 years ago. How does all this pavement, roads and sidewalks and buildings, impact the water cycle? What process is severely diminished? Consider the hydrologic cycle that we drew previously. What does pavement do? What process is diminished? Infiltration. Thus, when it rains, instead of gradual infiltration into the soil and groundwater, all the water immediately flows off the roads to the nearest stream. Thus, not only do we have less groundwater, but we also increase local flooding. In most cities, new developments now have to consider water management to be sure that they do not add to the flood potential for an area. When Kenyatta College was built, we had to show that we would not be adding any more water to Redwood City's storm sewers. Some ways that new developments manage this is by using less pavement, using permeable pavements, and directing water to infiltration areas, for example, ponds that only fill during rain events. Pretty interesting stuff, and all things that you could implement in your own yard at your own home. As we learned when we looked at the Florida Everglades, nature has her own flood control methods, one of which is wetlands. For most of the 1800s and 1900s, the wetlands of the United States were destroyed without a thought. Now we understand the amazing ecosystem services that they offer: flood control, water purification, habitat, etc. But it's still a struggle to keep them from being filled in for the next Walmart or next housing development. This same process is happening here locally around the bay. Coastal wetlands are especially at risk because of the developer's dream of oceanfront properties. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates suggest that we have lost over 50% of our wetlands, though others contend that the number is much higher. If we want to reduce flooding, it'd be a good idea to protect the existing wetlands and restore our other areas that used to be wetlands back to their natural state. There's many different projects here locally where you can go and work on wetland restoration. Save the Bay is an organization that comes to mind that has volunteer opportunities for folks to go help with wetland restoration. Look again at this water cycle. Trees take up an amazing amount of water from groundwater and surface water sources. When widespread deforestation occurs, logging or fire, the following years often bring flooding and or mudslides. The American Forest website notes that a large tree can take up about 100 gallons of water per day. Further, a 5% increase in forest cover can reduce a city's stormwater runoff by 2%. So planting trees, or simply stopping deforestation, can definitely help lessen the impacts of flooding. Lastly, two of the most common flood control techniques of the 19th and 20th century were straightening channels to increase stream velocity and get rid of the water faster, and levees. Channel straightening simply shifts the flooding problem downstream, while simultaneously destroying wetlands which offered habitat and flood control. Building levees is still popular, but it lures whole communities into a false sense of security and also increases the damage that will be done if flooding does occur. Notably, setback levees offer a nice compromise. They allow for some floodplain development, but still allow the river to meander naturally. In this manner, less habitat is destroyed, some natural flood control is maintained, and if flooding does occur, the damage is much less. Pretty cool. Another enlightened option is to have lower levees and use a bypass when the water approaches the levee tops. Notably, this is done near Sacramento, California. Sacramento sits at the confluence of two of California's major rivers, the Sacramento River and the American River, and historically the city has flooded many, many times. Now the flood risk has been dramatically reduced while actually increasing wildlife habitat. Here's the city of Sacramento. There's the American River and the Sacramento River. just north of Sacramento, a bypass exists. When the river gets to a certain height along the levees, the water flows into this huge bypass that runs in what used to be the floodplain for the river. Now, of course, the bypass has levees along it, so it doesn't flow all the way towards the city of Sacramento. But in some places, that bypass is over 2 miles wide, and you've probably driven over it if you've taken Interstate 80 or Interstate 5 towards Sacramento. This water flows slowly back to the Sacramento River downstream of Sacramento, and along the way it infiltrates into the ground and provides great habitat for waterfowl and other animals. Pretty cool. On the other end of the spectrum, there's several issues associated with too little water. We're fairly familiar with some of these, as we're just now getting out of a recent drought. Pause the video and check out these issues. In the last few minutes of this video, I want to highlight some of California's water challenges. First, we're a drought state. Droughts are common and can be very prolonged. Water managers need to keep this in mind even during wet years, and citizens should keep this in mind too. But we generally forget about the drought a few months after it's been declared over. Also, most of our rain comes in the winter. If you grew up in California, this may seem normal to you, but it's not normal. It's crazy. Most of the world gets its heaviest rainfalls during the summer months. California and the very few other parts of the world that also have a Mediterranean climate are different. It generally does not rain at all here in the summer. Strange, and also a problem. When do we need water the most, especially since we're an agricultural state? Thus, we have to figure out how to store water when we get it in the winter and store it for when we need it in the summer. Dams and reservoirs help some, but luckily the Sierra Snowpack serves as by far our largest reservoir, gradually melting into the summer months, sending water down our major rivers. Another challenge is that over 2/3 of California water resources are in the north, and over 2/3 of the use is in the south, including the southern Central Valley. So not only do we have to figure out the timing issue, but we also have to transport water hundreds of miles. California's aqueduct system is an engineering marvel that is also prone to leaks, evaporation, earthquakes, and subsidence. Lastly, one of California's biggest threats to our water supply is climate change. If the Sierra Snowpack melts earlier, it could be a twofold disaster. First, flooding, as we don't have enough reservoir space to hold the water. And second, drought. Because snowpack is our most important water source, if it all melts in February or March, we won't have snowpack for us in June and July to melt and gradually fill our reservoirs for use in August and September. So even though some climate models suggest we may get more rain as we approach the consequences of climate change, this is actually not a good thing if that rain comes as rainfall and not snow, and if it comes earlier in the springtime. So how do we develop a more sustainable water supply to manage our way through these droughts? Well, for years, water managers in California dealt primarily with the supply side of the problem. Find more water, find more water, find more water. Basically, this meant tapping into more rivers, building more dams and reservoirs, pumping more groundwater, and more recently, looking into desalination. Stop the video and come up with some pros and cons of each of these supply side strategies. More recently, in the last 2 decades, we've realized that we can't just address supply. We also need to address the demand side of the issue. Water efficiency and conservation can dramatically decrease water demand. Additionally, water efficiency and conservation projects are generally much cheaper than new supply projects. Thus, our greatest untapped water source in California is water efficiency and conservation. Indeed, we need to develop efficiency and conservation strategies in all segments of our society: agriculture, industry, and residential use.